Hello and welcome to another episode of Creative Walks. And today I wanted to talk to you about this idea I've been thinking for a few days now, that is the flow of culture. And what I mean by the flow of culture is how ideas and music and movies and basically cultural artifacts go from one culture to another. But I was thinking of this with a very specific trigger. I have this WhatsApp group. It's a very common thing in Brazil for friends to be on different kinds of groups. It's a very local thing there. And I have these two friends, and one of them is sort of like an accountant, financial advisor. The other, he is a lawyer by training, but he works as a judge assistant in Brazil, so he's a government employee. And I know these guys for the last, I would say, 20 years plus. Like, we're very good friends. And we talk about all different kinds of subjects. They sort of keep me integrated with some politics from Brazil, which I don't pay attention to naturally. But as they start getting older, they start paying attention to those things that when we were younger, I made a point not to pay attention to. But that's a little bit besides the point. But I started introducing in our conversations a little bit of the subjects that I'm actually interested in. And one of them was my interest in world music and how I really, really, really love to explore and discover new music. And that got me telling them how over time, especially because I lived for a fairly long time in Canada, about 10 years of my life. Then I lived in Brazil, I lived shortly in the US, and I also lived now I live in Kyiv for a while. And I had the opportunity not to have as much travel as I wanted or as I'm going to have this year and next year. But I was able to go to a bunch of different places in the context of working in culture, meaning I went to do drumming shows, or I went with my band, or I went with my wife to do shows, or I went to do photo shoots. So I got a little bit of the local flavor of a lot of culture. And I was telling my friends, in terms of music, one crazy thing that happens all over the world, it's not a thing that is from Brazil or from Ukraine. One thing that happens is that you have usually people liking the music from their country, their local music, they're usually their local pop music, and they like American and British music, right? Rock and roll, you have a little bit of Led Zeppelin, everybody loves, I don't know, Elvis, or the Beatles, or I don't know, whoever is important these days with rap, and all those things. And one thing that I noticed is that, I noticed this the first time in a cab in Bulgaria. I was in Sofia, and then we go into the cab, and the guy's listening to this music from Bulgaria, and I always love the music from Bulgaria. It's so interesting and different. And then I started talking in English with my friend that was with me in the taxi, and the guy instantly switches to an American station, which has some American pop. And then I told him, no, please, can you please move it back to, or was it my wife? I don't remember. But I said, no, put please the music back, like whatever it was before. And then one thing that I noticed is like how all over the world you go to places and they're always playing American music or British music sometimes in places where they actually do not speak the language at all. Or most of people don't speak the language, but they listen to the music. I always got very interested in that. That's the case in Brazil too. And that's not poo-pooing American music nor British music. It's very important. But I got thinking about this from the point of view of the flow of culture and where are we getting our culture. And I know there's a lot of talk that I really don't agree with in terms of imperialism and the specific countries being super strict and going and taking over other cultures. That does happen. That has happened. I'm sure that will happen. And I think that has a lot to do with what's going on in terms of music. But at the same time, I think it's too simplistic because I think the US specifically, it's a powerhouse for the creation of culture. However, if you don't speak the language, why would you just focus on the music of, let's say, in English from the United States? Why not listen to Polish music or to, I don't know, music from Ghana or from China, for example, which has a much bigger population, or India? And so I started thinking about this idea of the flow of culture. So we have basically, when you see the landscape of appreciation of music, it seems to be that people in other countries, they like their own music and they like American British. But there is very little cross-pollinations of countries, generally speaking, like on pop culture, aside from two main kinds of music. I'm talking about music specifically in this case, just to illustrate. And I know these are generalizations, but bear with me, there's like a sort of a thesis that I'm trying to get to. When you get Latin music, like music sung in Spanish. I know there's a lot of influence from the US, from the Spanish-speaking population there, and I think that influences the world through the US. But independently of that, let's say there is some prevalence of Spanish music in the world, and now a little bit of K-pop, which is Korean pop music, which sort of came out of nowhere in terms of the world climate. But especially younger generations, they have a lot of influence that comes from K-pop. And then my insight for the last couple of days, was that I think in culture, like movies, for example, since my wife is Ukrainian, and she shows me all these movies and TV series that influence her culture, which are like Turkish TV series and soap operas that people in Ukraine and Russia and Slavic countries in general usually like to watch, and things that are usually not going to Brazil. I never heard of it. I never even thought of going to look for those things. But I developed a taste for it. And then I was looking into some Indian movies because we were both interested in the aesthetics of those places. There are these movies which are actually blockbusters on their own right, and they're almost invisible for Western ears and Western eyes. And then I was thinking how we have to, like, at least I make it like a point to fight that, let's say, colonization in a way, because I think there's so much to be learned in other cultures. And I think we have, in terms of how we do business, we had, starting like from the 50s, 60s, with the invention of very much cheaper and more effective transportation between countries. We started having this globalization phenomena of having products coming from all over the place. That's why you have, for example, in beer, you have today beers from all over the world being transported cheaply and sold fairly cheaply in many places. And people develop this taste of like, oh, I like beer from this country and wine from that country, and these guys do this way. And in products, it's common to have a product that is decentralized production. You have one part created in the US, another part created in Korea, another part created in China, and it's all assembled and sold and all those things. So there is a fairly developed already globalization in terms of production of products, but not really of culture. It seems like we're still having this. That's why I was thinking of this in terms of the flow of culture. Where is all our main influences coming from? And what does that say about our culture? And finally, I just wanted to mention that I don't mean this as the general, like, my friend even called me out on that. He said, oh, you sound like one of those like French movie critics saying that the American canned movies are all trash and blockbusters, the good things like Godard. And that's not what I mean at all. I'm talking about the appreciation as we have with food. Before, like, I even remember when I was a kid, I'm old enough to like remember those times when like having sushi was like something you did when you traveled, when you go to a big city. It was not very common. Or having like French food, or having Ethiopian food. And having lived, for example, in Toronto, like in Canada, where you have like 50% of the population being from somewhere else and still working, fascinatingly enough, as a first world city. You have like, if you want to go to an Ethiopian shop, you can go and you'll have authentic cuisine from that place, albeit very expensive. But you have this tasting of different foods from different places, and then people start doing fusion, and at the same time people started like really getting into like Indian food or the famous ones, and then the not so famous ones too, and that's sort of like a worldwide phenomena, and that's amazing. That's something that I think should be embraced more. And that's I started thinking, instead of complaining about those things, how can my work as an artist be, even if a little bit of a light into the direction that I think would be beneficial for everyone, of sharing the things that we love. And one of the quotes that is the most important in my life, over time I've come to it again and again, is a quote by Carl Sagan, where he said that when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And I know that I am in love with so many different things, and every time I discover like a new kind of music or like a specific kind of pattern that I see in the clothing, in ethnic fashion and all those things, I really want to find a way to present that to the world and try to incorporate that into my daily practice. And that's basically the things that I've been struggling to do in my own work. How to make the things that make me mad, or the things that make me, oh, it could be so much more, it could be so much richer for everyone. How can I be not a force of complaining, which is the easy one, but how can I try to be a force to actually make a change, and make a change by example? So as one final quote, just to finish this off, which seems to be nothing to do with what I'm talking about, I think is very related. When they interviewed, it was not Andre Agassi, it was his arch enemy, which Pete Sampras. In his book, he talks about how he was like a very quiet guy and a very quiet player, and he's like this genius in the tennis court. And then he got one day kind of upset, and then he said like, I'll let my racket do the talking. And I thought that was such a cool, interesting way of an elegant of dealing with situations, which is, instead of like complaining and talking and doing all these things, he will let his work speaks for itself. So let your racket do the talking. I'll try to let my music and my photography do the talking. So I hope you found this interesting, and that you can try to think of these kinds of things to apply to your own creative practices. And even if it's not in the context of creative practices, at least what kind of voice you're putting into the world. Are you complaining about things, going on social media and saying, oh, this should be this way or this should be that way, instead of letting your racket do the talking, do the actual acts that will make the world more like you think it should be. So with that, I'll talk to you tomorrow. I hope you enjoy it. Hit me up on social media at Pedro Bonatto. If you like this specific podcast, I would ask you to share with your friends, just to mention like my name, or check out Pedro's podcast. I think you'll enjoy it. That will really mean a lot to me. And that's it. See you tomorrow.